Again, thank you everyone for coming today, 2022 COTA conference. And we're going to be talking today about our affordability report. So in fall 2022, MDUDE, we distributed a survey to institutions, to students specifically, asking questions regarding the affordability of their experience. Can they pay for college and their related life expenses while in college? Again, the reason we did this was because of COVID. We did not want to put an extra burden on institutions that were already dealing with so much. And again, just really interesting results coming from student surveys, getting their perspective along with the quantitative data as well. We modeled this survey after the California Student Aid Commission's Student Expenses and Resources Survey. That's a mouthful. SEERS, I probably should just say that. And we actually had a pretty amazing turnout, just shy of 10,000 responses. And in terms of the demographics, the representativeness of the survey, we actually did really good. Next slide, Sam. So in terms of the racial breakdown, our numbers actually came in 1 to 2 percentage points of Missouri at large. So that's fantastic. Roughly about 75% of the respondents were women. So we were a little overrepresented of women. And then we were 75% of our respondents were traditional college-age students, and about 25% were modern students, what we used to call non-traditional students, pretty much anyone over the age of 25. And on the FAFSA, that's what qualifies you as a independent student as well. I'm not going to go through all these demographic ones, but I do want to point out that 13.6 of our respondents identified as having a disability, which I believe is higher than what most schools usually report. So students are identifying themselves as a disability at higher rates on our survey. And also 4.8% of our survey respondents self-reported as being on SNAP benefits, food stamps. When looking at our data, it was clear that I believe almost a quarter of our students, based on their income, would have qualified for food stamps. So it's pretty stark that a lot of the students that we have here that are saying that they need additional support would qualify for this kind of stuff, but either because they don't know about it or it's so difficult to do it, only 4.8, 5% of our students actually applied for food stamps or were on food stamps at the time of the survey. Next slide, Sam. Even more interesting, and I guess this is kind of common knowledge for anyone that's a teacher. I've been teaching since 2018. I have never met a student that isn't at least working part-time. And over half of our respondents reported to being employed in some fashion. And a quarter reported working more than one job, which is astounding. I worked full-time during grad school and I would never want to repeat that experience again. So props to our students for pushing through. The demographics of our non-white respondents, are BIPOC students were more likely to be modern students. In other words, older students, generally working age Missourians. So as opposed to the average from the total cohort, which was about 1 in 4. So differences in race when it comes to the age and the kind of pathway to college as well. Credit hour load, almost all of our students, 82.1, reported as being full-time students. I think Sam's going to go into more detail about this, why that's the case, and I think it has to do with financial aid mostly. And then in terms of parental education, a lot of our students were either first-generation students or had a parent that just had one parent that went to college or some college. So a lot of first-generation students coming into the pipeline, which is fantastic, but presents its own challenges as well. Sam, next slide. One of the big things that came up during the survey was the impacts of COVID-19. And rather than starting negatively with the impacts, as I believe we all know how it's affected us and our family and our friends, we wanted to just take a quick positive look as well, that the switch to remote learning and alternative delivery methods for the students was generally positive. Again, I've been teaching since 2018, and I actually switched to a asynchronous learning style where students post their own videos at their own time, in addition to our occasional large group Zoom meetings as well. And my participation has never been higher. And I think Sam's going to go through some of the quotes that the survey the students gave us, some of the data that this made it easier for a lot of students to balance their work and school responsibilities and able to catch up with their classwork while they're working. Again, 50% of our students were working, a quarter of them working 2 jobs. So asynchronous alternate delivery methods, really helpful for students, we found. Next slide, Tim. And I just this is just kind of our thesis statement. A summary of all the data that we found. Affordability, the cost of college, is affecting everyone in Missouri, right? But there are certainly more groups that are disadvantaged economically than others, and that results in different results. We found particularly non-white students, working age Missourian, again, those modern students, and low-income Missourians were disproportionately impacted by the high cost of college. Again, no one likes paying this much for college. Everyone is negatively affected by it, but some groups are hurting more than others, we found. Even when evaluated alongside other barriers, both professional and personal, the cost of college for everyone is overwhelmingly cited as a factor for making students' lives more difficult. Sam, next slide. Yeah, so we actually asked the respondents to provide a score from 1 to 8, 1 being the biggest, what is the biggest obstacle for you, 8 being the smallest obstacle. And we got an overwhelming response. Sam, the next slide, just because the graphic is so much easier to show. 52.52% cited that the cost of college was the #1 barrier to their success. Nothing really even came close in comparison. The closest other was, again, balancing school and work responsibilities, which essentially can be, compacted into that cost of college because students are working so they can afford college, so they can eat, so they can transport themselves and get books. So again, the cost of college just overwhelmingly cited as the #1 reason why students are having a difficult time, even during the pandemic. So I think that's enough of introduction from me. Sam, I'm gonna hand it off to you to go into more detail about some of the really amazing results that you got out of the survey. Sam, you're muted.
Of course I'm muted. Thank you, Tracy. One of the biggest things that we wanted to highlight beyond just like the survey data was also the student voices. Because we hosted these focus group sessions to supplement the findings from the survey, we were able to get some really, really rich information and testimonials from students. And I'm going to read a handful of them off as the presentation goes on, because I think it's really important to let every word of the lived experience of these students sink in. More annoying thing about the financial aid at my institution is that all the payments are online, but they don't label the payments. It just shows the balance you have to pay, but it doesn't show what it's for. Like one day I just got an email saying, you have a new bill, and it was $80, but it didn't say what the $80 was for. So I had to contact the financial aid office and ask them what it was for. And then they had to look it up and tell me. So I feel like it would have been easier for them to just label it because it was just like a violin lesson lab fee. I don't know, but they could have labeled it under the payment. So anytime I get a new bill, and it's usually pretty small because of scholarships, but anytime I do, I don't know what it is because they don't label it. So I have to go to the financial aid office every time. And I think seeing the experience distilled into a package like this where it's really hard to ignore, as I think we all can relate to the experience of the increasing bureaucratization of our lives, making things difficult for us. And this certainly applies to students as well. And this was something that they shared with us time and time again. Another student testimonial that is very difficult to go through, but I think it's worth reading aloud. I was depleted of all my savings through my advisor who was new and misinformed me fatally. I cannot find a job and I've been denied by 5 places. I cannot afford the little things, the feminine products, extra school supplies, gas, class needs, songbooks, piano subscriptions. I have to ask people for quarters to pay my printing fee every month since I have to print my own homework. We had countless, and I mean countless, testimonials from students, even the ones that couldn't join us for the focus groups, but wanted to go that extra mile to share their stories in the open response section of the survey. I think this really kind of goes to show how much students are hurting and how much they need folks in the higher education sphere to listen to them when they share their stories about their struggles, figuring out what the right office to go is, trying to get clarity on bills, the frustrations of trying to just balance it all, because today's students go through a lot. And this is another story that I think was just really, really gut wrenching. I was almost unable to register for my second semester classes because I had money due to the school. My mom and I had been up to date on our end of the payments, but my dad, on the other hand, had not. Because of his irresponsibility as a parent, I had to chip in more of my savings along with borrowing money from my grandpa to make sure that I could get into the classes I needed. I don't want to have to rely on my dad for money, but quite frankly, college is too expensive to be done by a single parent household, even if my mom and I were both contributing. My academics were threatened by a factor I couldn't control, and it was really scary and heartbreaking. I just hate to think that there are households out there who don't have savings accounts or a grandparent to fall back on when it comes to their education. And before I dive into a little bit more of the hard quantitative data, I just want to stress again, this is a small subsection of students. We had about 20 to 25 that participated in the focus groups, and out of the 9,921 that responded to this survey, about 500 or so contributed to the open response section. That's a pretty small piece of the pie, and look at the stories that we're hearing. So I want to move on to food insecurity. Respondents were asked to evaluate how true certain statements were to their personal lives. And you'll see the statements on the right. I worried whether my food would run out before I got money to buy more. I couldn't afford to eat balanced meals. The food that I bought just couldn't last, and I didn't have money to get more. The percentages that you see in orange are the students that replied often true or sometimes true to these prompts. Really, really jarring things to look square in the face in this manner. More student testimonials. I go weeks without buying food and groceries because I pay my rent so I won't get evicted. I eat at work, and when I don't work, I drink coffee to trick my stomach into thinking it's full. A different respondent stated, I often had to skip meals or eat very little each day while living on campus due to living dorm expenses being too much for me to afford on my own, and had to begrudgingly ask family for help often. Meal plans, as expensive as they were, never lasted throughout the week. My classes and their homework took up too much time for me to be able to even work part-time, and I didn't have a ride. Many on-campus jobs were strict in who they hired, and many were dependent on the student's major. Many jobs I couldn't apply for simply because they didn't relate to my major or because they were full. I didn't want to walk to a job on campus because of the number of assaults that happened in the area, and I didn't want to become a statistic. And this relates to someone that we heard from in one of our focus groups. This was an international student who's had their working situation was tied to their campus being open. But when COVID-19 shut everything down, their job went right along with it, and they had to very quickly scramble to find a new job, and B, a new living situation, because their previous living situation was predicated on having the on-campus job. So many things can just cause such a devastating ripple effect that makes students' lives much harder than they need to be. So here's a little bit more information on the food insecurity section of this survey. The I can't afford food section, despite only being yes or no, provided a wealth of information regarding who struggles with food insecurity in Missouri. Prior to disaggregating by race and ethnicity, 12% of the respondents replied to the statement, I can't afford food, with the answer yes. However, when disaggregated by race, every non-white racial and ethnic group had a higher percentage of yes answers than the aggregated total, and you'll see that on the chart on the next slide. Black Missourians in particular reported not being able to afford food at a rate almost double that of the average aggregate response. Missourians on SNAP benefits, Missourians with disabilities, and Pell and Access Missouri grant recipients are also overrepresented among students who reported not being able to afford food. And this is just more evidence that the supports that we currently have for our students they're just not going far enough. Or even the students that are on the social programs specifically meant to get them access to the food they need, they're among the most likely to report that they're not able to adequately feed themselves while they're going to school. So now we're moving into a little bit of a fuzzier category that we declared unmet need. What you see in front of you is a list of 6 prompts that students were asked to evaluate based on how self-confident they were in their ability to pay. So the responses were on a Likert scale from I strongly agree that I think I'm able to pay for these things to I strongly disagree. For a student to be put in this unmet need category, they had to answer either somewhat disagree or strongly disagree. And as you can see, based on the data that's in front of us right now, it's tuition and books. Those are the 2 things that students seem to struggle with the most, at roughly 46% and 36% respectively, reporting that they had unmet need in that area. And here is the population percentage of students that said they had unmet need. Now, if you're looking at the bar charts and you're thinking to yourself, these percentages don't add up to 100%, what's going on here? This isn't the population percentage relative to the entire survey body, but rather within each group. So for example, of all Black respondents to the survey, 35% of them reported having some form of unmet need. Of all the white students that responded to the survey, 26% of them reported having some form of unmet needs. So if you were wondering, this looks a little weird, that's why. We're analyzing these percentages within their respective groups as opposed to comparing them to the whole. Here's some more information about students that met our categorization for unmet need. 17.96% of them reported having a disability, so overrepresentation even compared to the survey population as a whole. 8.8% of students with unmet need are on SNAP benefits, almost double that of the general survey population. 51.3% of students with unmet need are either Pell Grant recipients or Access Missouri grant recipients. 34.16% of students reporting having unmet need are working age Missourians between the ages of 25 and 64. And 90.53%, so the overwhelming majority of students with unmet need reported being on some form of financial aid. And there's one other thing that I want to address when it comes to analyzing unmet need based on the specific categories of tuition and fees, books, housing, transportation. There was an ambiguous middle category of neither agree nor disagree that we could have included, but we didn't for the sake of trying to keep things as precise as possible. But I just wanted to point that out and address the fact that if we had included that neither agree nor disagree, can't really assess, I don't really know how to evaluate my situation from one week to the next, all of those initial percentage points for housing, books, and those other categories would have been about 12 to 17% higher across the board. And I'll hand things back over to Tracy to finish things off on what we hope is more of a hopeful note than the rather dire data that we've just shared. We don't want to leave things off on a downer note.
Yeah, we never want to leave things too sad. So we did find in the student responses that they definitely expressed their issues with the system, with financial aid, with simply trying to survive. But at the end of the day, most of the students do feel that their education is valuable and worth it. Many of them still feel that the struggle is worth it. And so the prevailing sentiment from the students that spoke to us in the focus group was hope. That their investment is going to be worth at the end of this hardship that they currently face, especially with the pandemic still going on. And I guess I'll just leave it with one more quote from a student. I will admit the journey has been difficult, but I have hope that this is all worth it to give my family a better life and future. At this point, I feel I have nothing left to lose and everything to gain. So here I am trying to complete my degree. I have a few semesters left and I won't stop until I'm done, no matter what the financial cost. I actually feel that this kind of sums it up all in the way. Sums up everything perfectly. Hopeful, but also very realistic and understanding of the kind of dire financial situation that most students are in right now. So I'll leave it at that. I did want to say really quick though that because the food insecurity is such a huge aspect of this, we really do want to promote the DSS on Campus initiative, which would provide a social worker on campus to sign students up for social services that they clearly need and would qualify for. Again, most of our students, I mean, not most of our students, 25% of our students about would have qualified for food stamps. However, we only had 5% actually say that they were receiving these benefits. That includes, in addition, stuff like lighting and heating assistance and childcare. So again, a really good opportunity as well. I'm sorry, Christy, which link? I can put it in the chat, but oh yes, no problem. I will put the link to the DSS on campus in the chat. Great. Sam, you want to finish off?
Sure. So I just want to piggyback off one more thing Tracy said about students, especially as they're trying to assess what kind of aid can I apply for? What am I eligible for? How do I even get access to it? It didn't make its way into this presentation, but we will be discussing it in the reports. The access to FAFSA funds, that was overwhelmingly cited as a barrier for students as their experience. Tons and tons of complaints throughout the survey. And yet we know from national level data that about $2 to $3 billion of unclaimed FAFSA funds goes unused. And yet when you ask the students, well, hey, why is that? They will share story after story about the bureaucratic hurdles of trying to apply. We had one student in particular, and this really stood out to me because of how succinctly he summed up his situation, where he was talking about how he was originally not sure if he even wanted to go to college. So he took a year off to work. And then when he applied to school, because FAFSA goes on the prior year, he didn't qualify because he made too much money when he didn't even know that he was going to be applying to school later on. And he finished up his testimonial with the line, "I felt like I was punished for my hard work." And I think that's the kind of stories that as we're figuring out how do we make students' lives better, that we really need to listen to and advocate for. So thank you all for coming to listen to our research. We're really, really passionate about this stuff, and we will take whatever opportunities we can to talk about it and get it in front of the eyes of other people. And we would love to take any questions you might have. Did any students talk about how the HERF funds helped or did not help? I don't believe that anyone, from what I recall, talked about HERF funds specifically. It was mostly FAFSA and things like SNAP and TANF and access to medical care that were included as like selectable fields for the survey. And I don't believe HERF was one of them, but that is good information for us to keep in our back pocket as we figure out how to, like, what kinds of questions that we want to ask. Because like we said at the beginning of the slide, we based so much of how we designed this survey instrument off of the California Student Aid Commission. So if we try to do a project like this again, like, that's really good information for us to know so that we can ask students better questions.
Just on that note with COVID, we did have Sam, I think you briefly mentioned this, but we did have a lot of students that said that the change in their parents' economic status due to COVID was not reflected in the FAFSA for that academic year. So their economic situation changed drastically, yet they still were based on, previous, financial aid from last year, which was something that a vast majority of students complained about, in addition to the fact that Access Missouri was only available to full-time students and not part-time students. So just, related concerns to COVID and financial aid in general.
Yeah, thanks for supplementing that point, Tracy.
I see a question from Chrissy, and I believe most schools have an appeals process for the FAFSA for those emergency situations. But my understanding, it's pretty difficult to do, and there's no guarantee it'll be approved. So I think that's why so many students had issues with it. I honestly, as someone that was in college not too long ago, I don't think I would have taken the effort to even try, because I don't know if it would have been worth it. But that's my personal perspective.
Yeah, there was definitely a prevailing sense amongst the responses from the survey that students found their institutions to be difficult to navigate. Many stories about not knowing who the right person to call was and having to deal with folks that weren't particularly helpful. And even if the infrastructure is there to provide the aid that students need, I think we've been talking a lot over the course of the day about how college is overwhelming enough as it is, and especially the case for any non-traditional students, transfer students too, feeling this cultural gap. It really only takes one or two negative interactions with someone in a position like that to completely shade your perception on how helpful your institution is going to be for you. So I think that's unfortunately part of the lived reality of a lot of students, is whether based on their own experiences or based on their friends, there's a general prevailing sense that the resources to help them are almost difficult to access on purpose. I think that's how a lot of students feel.
I just have to add one more anecdote of my own experience. One time I had to go to financial aid, and they sent me to financial aid. They said I was in the wrong spot. I traveled like a half a mile across campus to go somewhere else, who sent me to another building, another half a mile away, just to send me back to financial aid. And I've heard similar stories like that before, and it's incredibly demoralizing for the students. So yeah, I can only imagine that's part of the problem as well.
Yeah, very similar thing happened to me as I was preparing for my freshman year of college. And thankfully, my trip across offices was just by phone calls, so there was no physical walking entailed. But it's not fun when you're just trying to get an answer to go through 3 phone calls. I see a question: is the state discussing any statewide policy related to the stopping of withholding of transcripts if they have an unpaid balance? There's a handful of policies that we're figuring out what we want to advocate for, what we have the power to advocate for, and what groups of people we need to ship it in front of. Dr. Younger talked about the NISTS conference that happened in St. Louis 2 weeks ago, and I was speaking with some folks there that were talking about academic clemency for students, that if you started school a certain amount of time ago and you wanted to re-enroll, but you got a bad grade in the class and you didn't want it to, like, your past academic performance to impact your future GPA, that there's ways, mechanisms that certain states and certain institutions have to waive that. And that's something that we've been discussing internally about how we can mobilize that for things like the Adult Learner Network for transfer students, for any students really. But yeah, we're always in conversations figuring out what can we do to advocate for this process being easier for students. That's a really good thing to add in the chat. Thank you.
Sam, just one more thing to add on to that. When it comes to Missouri reverse transfer, I think one of the issues is that people that have stopped out of school tend to owe a balance, and then it kind of defeats the purpose of them re-enrolling in the community college to get their associate's degree. And so that's something we've been talking about. If you enroll in the reverse transfer, if you have owe a certain amount, maybe that can be forgiven. Of course, there's so many hurdles we have to jump through to get to that level, but that is something we have been discussing in the reverse transfer process.
All right, we got another question. I'm wondering, where and how do we balance student responsibility in researching and taking proactive steps in seeking the help and institutions, resources, and support services? That's a really good question. That's a really, really good question that has a million different answers. I think one of the more common themes that I've heard, and this spans like across approaches, across policy implementations, is meeting students where they're at. Tracy just mentioned reverse transfer. One of the states that we have been figuring out if we can emulate their successful strategy on is North Carolina. And they're in the same boat as us, where they are an opt-in state, and they were having issues at the outset of implementing the reverse transfer program, getting students to enroll in it. They had earned the degrees, they just weren't being awarded. And if you're a student trying to navigate college and someone asks you, hey, do you want to sign up for reverse transfer? If you don't already know what that is, chances are it's just going to register as, oh my God, it's one more thing on my to-do list. I already have 17 other things I need to take care of by the end of the day. I don't care, which I think is true for a lot of students, that sense of burdenness and overwhelmedness. So what they did was they set up a targeted email campaign. The communications were on point with it, where they reached out to the students they knew were eligible, let them know what the process was, and extended that olive branch to them in a way that they were able to grasp and understand what exactly they were getting themselves into. And they saw the amount of degrees that they awarded skyrocket as a result of that. I'm obviously that's not the kind of solution that'll fix everything. Not every problem is going to be, alleviated by a marketing push. But I think that a lot of times things can just be a matter of like students not feeling like they have the resources, or the resources that they do have could be more like tailored to catch their attention. If you get what I'm trying to say. There's a million different ways to approach this.
In regards to resources being available and students knowing about it, when it comes to the DSS on campus, we've had a lot of great success at St. Louis Community College, who put their social service worker in the mental health department, like section of their campus, and had a pretty intensive widespread campaign, promoting the fact that this person was there, and they've had numbers that far exceeded our expectations compared to some other schools. So I think if the resources is in a place that's easily accessible and people know about it, they will take advantage of it. But yeah, that's my take on that.
Any other questions for the chat? Thank you so much for sharing that, Costa. I think that's exactly the kind of success story that we want to see implemented for our students, making the most out of the available resources and figuring out what can be done to just get the things in front of the people who need them. Thank you so much for sharing.
Sam, I think we're good. No more questions.
Yeah, if we got nothing else in the chat, then I think we are good. I just want to say thank you so much again for attending this conference and attending our our breakout presentation. We're really happy to share this research with you. My apologies again to any of you that had experienced technical difficulties earlier in the day. We hope that that didn't hamper your conference experience too much. And we're looking forward to seeing all of you at noon for the closing sessions. Thank you so much and have a great rest of your day.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.